should be above your feet. However, here, when you push their knees out, their feet roll along the sides of their feet like that. Don't do that. The centers of your feet should feel like suction cups on the ground. Think of your foot as a root, and your feet should be flat on the ground. And you should feel the bottom of your feet, the middle part, trying to touch the ground, at least touching the ground. So you want to push your feet out, you want to push your knees out, but you want your feet to stay flat, not up on their sides. Just like you're compromising, that's all I'm saying.
All right, I guess I'm just going to get started. Sorry, I can't hear you guys in there, but hopefully you can hear me. Yeah? All right, great. I am Erica Correa. I am a iOS engineer for EXO Group, specifically work on the Knot Wedding Planner app. This is my son, Tino. You may hear him in the background. My apologies in advance. Even though this picture makes him look like an angel on my desktop, he is 3, and not so much sometimes. So I thought it would be kind of fun, since I'm an iOS engineer and I'm presenting about an iOS topic, to, instead of do my presentation in PowerPoint, to run it on the simulator, just for a little extra fun. So here we go. This is my Need for Speed presentation. It's a case study of how EXO optimized the image loading time on the Knot app and why that's a big deal. It's a beautiful jiffy of our team being party parrots on Halloween. So this all started at the Strange Loop conference that I went to in St. Louis about 1.5 years ago. There was this presentation by Paul Kinlan about the future of the mobile web. And he said in that talk that 40% of users abandon a site that takes more than 3 seconds to load. So that was a pretty scary statistic. I was sitting there in the auditorium and I started opening apps on my phone to see how long it took for those to open, and was wondering, you know, what this statistic looked like for mobile. And so what I did some digging online when I got home and found out that mobile users expect their app to take 4 seconds or less to load. And 23% of users abandon an app after the first time that they use it. So in making that first impression, there's really not a second to spare. You want it to load right away, and so the user can get their feet wet in the app. So I took a look at the Knot app to see how long it was taking our app to load. An embarrassing 8.6 seconds is how long it was taking for our app to load. So more than double what a user wants and expects. And Apple actually recommends 400 milliseconds or less. Now, I didn't see really any apps, at least bigger apps, that did that. You know, and I was just kind of tapping and counting in my head. You know, there wasn't a way for me to measure other apps and how long they took. But Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, all of them were taking about a second, and our app was taking much longer. So the way that you can measure this, if you want to do this on your own, is you edit your scheme and you add just this one line here in the environmental variables, DYLD print statistics with a value of 1, which is bool for true. And then whenever you run the app, it'll print that out in the console. It'll print out all of your app launch time statistics. This number is going to vary depending on multiple things, including what scheme you're running in. You want to make sure that you're running in the scheme that's closest to whatever you're going to have in the App Store. So for us, that's our Planner App Store scheme. It can also change depending on the device type, you know, the internet strength of the user, which you won't have control over, but maybe you want to, you know, fake different internet connections to see how the app fares in different situations. And then this also changes in cold versus warm starts, which is a big one. So for those who don't know, a cold versus warm start would be like I'm running the app for the first time, or I have the app running in the background while I'm using another app, and then I go back. And it's also different when you first install the app and run it for the very first time. So you can try these different environments and see how it works. This 8.6 seconds was on a cold launch. So this was pretty scary, and we wanted to see what was taking so long. So I dug into the print statistics and had a big surprise. So it turns out most of our time was spent loading our images. 6 seconds out of that 8.6 seconds, which is 70%, was spent just loading our images, which I thought was pretty confusing. I had done a lot of digging around on the internet, looked at WWDC talks on the topic, read about what different apps were doing, and they talk a lot about, you know, shortening your bridging headers and making sure you're not doing too much on app launch, making too many network calls, making sure things are asynchronous. Nobody was talking about, oh, by the way, we look at your asset catalog, look at all the images that are in there, and load them all on app launch. So I was pretty surprised, and everybody on our team was too. So once we knew that, it was kind of like, all right, well, now what do we do? So images are so important to delighting our users. So rather than using just less images inside the app, we needed to think of better ways to include them in the app rather than clogging up our asset catalog. So I wanted to show you the Knot app and just kind of give you an idea of the different kind of images that we have in here. So you can see we have something very simple like this little check mark or these X's and hearts, to images that are much more beautiful and you know, robust, like we have for our venues. You know, you can see all these different vendors that we have and their images for each one. Empty state images, just things that you know, inform the user, show them what different things on the page do. And they're all important, whether they're informative or just there to be, you know, visually delightful. So we had to come up with a few different solutions. The first thing that we did was we found this software that's for free online called LS Unused Resources. This little icon here. So what it can do is search any file that you give it, and it will look through the entire project and tell you what assets are not being used. So we literally had a bunch of assets in our asset catalog that weren't even used anymore. They were from old view controllers. You know, we're changing things all the time. It's a pretty old app. And the images never got deleted along with the code or along with the view controllers and the views. So that was the first thing that we did. If you want to use this, one thing I would definitely keep an eye out for is image names that are dynamically strung together at runtime. So we have, for example, the Not Best of Weddings award. So we have this award that certain vendors can get that's called the Not Best of Weddings. And we have one for every year since, I think, 2007. And we don't call each one, you know, the Not Best of Weddings 2007, the Not Best of Weddings 2008, right? We just do a for loop and run through it and build the string of the image name dynamically at runtime. So it looked like those images were never actually called in the app, but actually they were strung together at runtime. So you just kind of want to double check before you just delete everything. Definitely make sure you have a designer QA the app after you've deleted them to look at the PR and stuff before you merge in. So that was the first thing that we did. After that, we decided we needed to come up with different solutions for our vector and bitmap images. It's a pretty beginner concept, but for those who don't know the difference, a vector image would be something that's kind of drawn shapes. So each shape has a color, like this heart button. It's just a pink circle with a white heart inside. And a bitmap image is something like a photograph that each pixel is colored. So there are different ways that we handle those different kinds of images inside the app. So for our vector images, we found this software that we use called PaintCode. So if there's anybody listening in from other areas of EXO and other iOS developers, we have a license for this, so you can use this software as well. It's pretty inexpensive for those who don't work at EXO and are thinking about it. So this software is really pretty cool. What it does is let you drag in a vector image in the PDF format, and it will basically draw it for you in code. You just kind of adjust the canvas a little bit. So you just drag it in, and it creates a Swift file for you, and you can just export that file and add it to your Xcode project. So it's really, very cool. There were a couple of small challenges that we came across when we first started using it. First, a lot of the resizing behavior is repetitive. It's in every single view class that we were exporting. And so we decided to make this paint code utility class that handles the resizing behavior for us, and we could delete it out so that it was a little bit drier. Also, when you're working in the interface builder, there is a way to visually see the view drawn in interface builder, but it keeps running and running and running. Interface builder keeps drawing it over and over, so it slows it down. So we disabled that, and so it just looks like a clear view. So it's kind of hard to apply the auto layout constraints. What we've been doing is just applying a color to it, and then applying our constraints and then changing it back to clear so that you don't see that color at runtime. But when you actually run the app, you can see, the K or whatever the asset actually is. It's very, very cool. And the last issue that we had, which we just recently solved, is, normally a designer will send us a story, they're designed for a story. We'll see that there's an image in it, and we can go in the asset catalog and see if it's already in our app, and if it is, we'll use it, and if not, we need to add it. But with classes that are just drawn code, it's really hard to look at the code itself and say, oh yeah, we totally have that in the app. You can't really tell what it looks like unless you run the app and go see it. And so we were, for a while, just kind of running the app and looking around or asking, our team members if they've seen an asset like that, which obviously is not reliable, and you're going to start to see duplicates. So what I actually just did on Friday was create this hidden catalog that we can actually see all of our paint code views inside the app. So this is a little hidden debug view controller that we have that's only available in QA, where we can do different things to test in the app. And here's our paint code asset catalog. And here you can see all of these are actually drawn in code. These are all of our paint code assets that we're currently using. And if you tap on one, you can see the name of that view. We actually use an enum, so that draws the views for us automatically. It makes it really easy to work with. So if this icon is in a design that's sent to us, I can look in this catalog, I'll see it, and I'll say, oh, it's the timeline vendor icon view. Great, and I'll just call it. So that's what we do with all of our vector images so far. And for bitmap, so for this one, some of them we had to bite the bullet and put them inside the app. A lot of them we are now utilizing more our media API. So we store the bitmap images in the cloud using our media API, and then we can call the images at runtime. So we have this method that resizes the URL for that width, and we can just set it with an animation. So we'll always have this placeholder image, but it's great. We use the same, like 3, depending on what it's a placeholder for, throughout the app. So it's only 3 images in our asset catalog instead of all of these. And this also helps our SEO with Google to have all of these things in our media API. So after all of that, did it work? Our current app launch time, 1.5 years later, is 480 milliseconds, which is huge. We went from having about 320 images in our asset catalog. I just counted yesterday, we have 110. So we really did a great job decreasing. That wasn't, let's go back and take old images, and if they are vector, let's convert them to paint code, or let's move things to media API. We didn't do any code cleanup that way. We just made these changes moving forward. And even just doing that moving forward after 1.5 years, we saw such a dramatic improvement. we're only 80 milliseconds away from Apple's recommended start time. In fact, now when we run the DYLD print statistics, you actually don't even see the image load time listed anymore because it's negligible. So we still do need to check our app for unused resources every year. We want to keep an eye on this lunchtime number and make sure that it stays nice and low. But so it is something that we're going to have to maintain moving forward, but we have surpassed our goal that we had set for ourselves, which was we wanted to be less than a second, and we're actually less than half a second. Does anybody have any questions? You can, I guess, let John know, and he can message me, or you can send it in the chat.
Can you hear me at all, Erica?
Like very, very quiet, softly, yes.
What is the what is the environment variable mean?
Nope. I think you said something about the environment variable. Oh, yes. Here, I can show you. So you go here in your scheme drop down, you hit edit scheme. And under environment variables, it's right here, DYLD underscore print underscore statistics, and you set the value to 1. This is our paint code utility. In case anybody wanted to see, we have all of these cases. We have a view function that sets the view for each of our cases. And then our resizing behavior is here at the bottom. Wow, an unrelated question. What are my thoughts about React Native versus Swift? I would say that as a native iOS developer, I'm obviously a little bit biased. I love Swift, and I do not really like JavaScript, but so that's the biggest barrier for me. But I think for smaller applications, React Native is great. If your app is, just doing, showing a few view controllers, maybe just reaching a couple of API endpoints, then it's great. But by the time you have a large app like the Knot, for example, the amount of code you're going to have to write to make it work on different devices is going to end up being more than the native code, in my opinion. Anything else? Thanks.
Everyone should be muted except you.
I don't think we are.
Can you hear us, Erica?
I can now, actually.
But now we can't hear her.
Hey guys, by the way, I swear we're a tech group. We actually make software and stuff. We don't do hardware.
All right. Okay, hopefully you guys can hear me. Okay, so hi, I'm Allison. I work at Q2, and we make banking software. He also works there. We make banking software for financial credit unions and banks, obviously. My team makes websites for them. Other teams will make the apps and stuff. But as you can imagine, a lot of banks and credit unions have to worry about things like accessibility. People need to be able to access their money. So we have to worry about accessibility. So why should we build accessible websites and apps? Well, it turns out that according to the 2010 census, 1 in 5 Americans has some sort of disability. There are visual disabilities ranging from color blindness all the way to full blindness. There are hearing impairments going from wide varieties of to partial to full auditory deafness. There are physical or motor disabilities. Someone could be missing a hand, for example, and can't, or someone who can't operate a mouse. And then there's also cognitive disabilities, things that can impact your memory as you're trying to work with websites and apps. And another thing of note is disabilities can be permanent or temporary. Who's ever broken a bone? Yeah, me too. And I broke my wrist, so in that era, it impacted how I typed on a keyboard. So what tools do people with disabilities use? There's the obvious screen readers. There's JAWS on Windows, which is the most common screen reader out there. It's also the most expensive. Then there's an open source one called NVIDIA for Windows users. So there's finally a cheap option for people with disabilities. Then there's also VoiceOver, which is built into Macs. And that client one is actually pretty good. There's also VoiceOver for iOS devices, and Google has their own assistant as well. Another screen reader, another tool is a screen magnifier. This is good for people who are starting to lose their vision, especially as they get older. They can magnify sections of the screen as they roll over it, so they can see huge sections of text in a smaller window, or rather the other way around. Large sections of text in a full window. There's also alternative input devices, so people may have specially built keyboards in order to help them navigate. And then there's also voice to text. There's obviously Siri and Google Assistant, and then there's also Dragon, which allows users to actually, if that software doesn't allow them to actually directly pick up elements, they can actually say this quadrant, and narrow in on a button to click it. So how do we make our apps and websites accessible? I'm going to break it down into 4 simple things that I think are the easiest things to focus on, and the number 1 is the most important. Have good HTML structure. A lot of screen readers are actually using HTML5 spec to know what is what. So if we are following HTML5 spec, a lot of screen readers and even keyboard navigation can use the apps and sites. So having good syntax is very important. Tables, use tables like tables. So if you have a lot of rates tables, for example, like a lot of financial institutions have, tables are really good. We use lists for any group of related data. So OLs or ULs are really good for this. A lot of menus also, since they're related pieces of links, are often lists. Then headings as well. This actually follows a lot of SEO as well. You will have one H1, which is usually the title of the page. Then you'll have H2s being section headers, and H3s and H4s and so on. You have to have an H2 follow an H1, have an H3 follow an H2, an H4 follow an H3, and so on. These often, for screen readers, if you ever, you can jump from heading to heading, kind of like a section title, as you navigate through a website. So you can kind of think of headings as section headers. That it's just like conceptually groups of information that's easy to follow. That also helps me write better content. I don't know if it helps anyone else, but I just found that interesting. Paragraphs, this one's very self-explanatory. Large sections of text should be in a paragraph block. You can put breaks in there if you want. I prefer not to. I just like having paragraphs be paragraphs. Links, so this one's pretty interesting too. Obviously, the simple A tag, as we use for HTML, has to have a valid href. Otherwise, as you're tabbing through a website, it's going to skip right past it. So you need to have a valid href. Or it can be a hashtag if you're going to use JavaScript with it, but it has to have an href. Can't be a blank href. It has to be at least a hashtag. Then you can also use a button instead. If you don't want to have to worry about an href, buttons are really good for things that manipulate things on the page. So submit buttons, those are good buttons. Menu buttons, those are good. Little icons that navigate like filters or things like that. That's actually better use for a button than a link. Images need to have an alt tag. They can be blank, but they need to have an alt tag. That way screen readers can help differentiate if the image is decorative or if it has any extra meaningful information. I'll get to more into that in a second. And finally, Chrome, fortunately, is starting to pick up on this one. They actually now flag you in the console log if you have multiple IDs that are the same. IDs need to be unique. So your form inputs need to have unique names. Your form should have unique names. And we used to be pretty bad about this, in particular for login forms. We'd have the mobile login form versus the desktop login form, just use the same ID out of laziness. Then we realized we should have them be unique. So we got much better about that. All right, the truth about alt tags on images. I mentioned earlier that they have to have an alt tag. But what goes inside that alt tag? Well, I use these rules of thumb. Number one, and first and foremost, probably shouldn't have any text in the image at all. Obviously, logos are an exception. Those are always, almost always going to be an image. That's where you then put the company's name in the alt text. Otherwise, I would avoid text in images. They're also harder to make them responsive because then you have to worry about where the text is as the image size up and down. The next rule is if the image is a purely decorational, leave the alt tag empty. I don't care if there's 5 people in there. If it's a banner image, that's decoration. So you could just leave that be, leave it empty. I've had to clean up some alt tags on websites that were very descriptive and slightly racist because they were describing the races of the people in the photo. Anyway, and then if the image is wrapped in a link, so you have an A with an image inside of it, that image will need an alt tag because essentially you need to describe the action that that image is going to do when they follow through the link. So we usually just put an alt tag on an image if it's going to be a link. And then, yes, if an image is a logo or conveys other important information, that's where an alt tag description is used. We've also had a lot of FIs, financial institutions, if they have a lot of like team photos, specific like or a portrait of their CEO, they usually want us to put their name in that, and that is completely legitimate. We think it's a little redundant because as the screen reader reads through it, it reads their name in the photo, and then usually the next line is their name. So that it reads their name twice, but it's a valid use of an alt tag. All right, number 2, keyboard navigation. Tabbing order matters. I mentioned that tabbing is a really easy way to go through a website. Sometimes I do it out of sheer laziness because I don't want to move my hand from here to here. So I just tab. So visible links and buttons must be reachable. You want to be able to, as you're tabbing through a website, visit every section so that you can click on it or interact with it. Non-visible links and buttons must not be reachable. So it seems a little explanatory, but I don't want to go through your mobile menu when I'm on desktop. I'm just going to get really confused about where I'm supposed to be or where I am in the tabbing order. And links and buttons must be read in a top, upper, left top to a bottom right order, kind of like how we read. So if you have a menu that jumps to the right side and then moves left, it's really confusing because we expect to tab through a menu that is read as we read it. So tabbing order does matter. And then hiding elements versus invisibility. Display none and visibility hidden. Hide elements from tabbing and screen readers and your SEO too, so don't use them. Essentially, they're hiding elements in the DOM, so machines can't read them either. So instead, when we have text that we don't want people to see visually, but we want a screen reader to see, we use invisible classes, essentially. Screen readers, styling, but I'll have these slides up later that if you follow that link, there's a whole bunch of styling that you can use that will allow a screen reader to keep it there or read it, but it won't impact your styling at all. It essentially makes the content a height 0, width 0, and then pushes it all the way off in the distance, but it's still there in the DOM. And if you use like Foundation or Bootstrap, they already have these classes for you. You just need to know which ones they are. Now in Foundation, it's SR only. I think Bootstrap's the same. All right, number 3, helping the screen readers along. I mentioned earlier that screen readers will mostly get your HTML if they're in the proper order, and that is still pretty true. But a lot of these tips and tools were made for older versions of HTML. So things like this, the table. We still use these in our HTML5 just because it helps the screen reader know this is a column, this is a row, this is a group of information that is not separate and weird. So we add scopes, scope of call to the top row of each element to say, hey, I'm a column, I'm a column, I'm a column, and then each row down we'll add rows. And there's a whole bunch of documentation from W3. It's actually pretty easy to click through. So I recommend looking at that. And here's their example from a regular header. As you see, there's a row group, 2 call groups, and then a bunch of headers. And the table snippet here, they're using call group, like HTML5, to signify that there's going to have a call group, and they go down the order. This call group over here, if you're going to put a T-body on it, which I do recommend, I wish your example had it, it would be above the T-body, and the TR is in the T-body. All right, and now the truth about ARIA. I'm sure we've all heard about ARIA tags and roles. They're pretty common. A lot of times they're misused. So here are some helpful tips. Make sure that your ARIA role exists. I've seen so many people try to use role sidebar. There is unfortunately no role sidebar. There is a role aside. So you're supposed to use a side if you want a sidebar. There's also ARIA nav, main. There's a whole bunch that are out there. You probably only need to do the basic ones. Number 2, make sure ARIA tag is given correct data. I've seen a lot of like ARIA described bys, ARIA labels by, ARIA controlled by that are given plain text, but they want IDs. And this is part of the reason IDs need to be unique. We need to reference one specific element. So these ARIA tags are looking for an ID. If you're not giving it an ID, it usually confuses screen readers. Place the ARIA tag on a correct element. I've seen Foundation is guilty of this. They'll put their ARIA tags on the LI element instead of an A in their nav, and really it should be on the A because that is what you're clicking. You're clicking a link, you're not clicking the LI element. So they really should be on the A. And then here is the official W3 spec from January 2018, so just last month. If you ever want to read, there's a whole bunch out there of ARIA roles and ARIA tags, and can frankly be a little confusing. But the MDN's document on accessibility actually has a really simplified, flushed down version of it, and that's the one I usually go to when I'm looking up ARIA stuff. They're just little tags that you put on elements that would that give hints to screen readers. You'll usually see ARIA label if you want to just put, like, if you have a learn more button, Usually that learn more button, that's not enough text for a screen reader as people are jumping from link to link. You're just hearing learn more, learn more, learn more. You don't know what it's learning more about. The ARIA tags add extra information specifically for screen readers to use as you're going through. Does that answer your question? Okay. All right, number 4, colors and contrast. So this is the last one that I'm going to put on here. This is the one that usually gets overlooked because a lot of people think blindness, they go 100% fully blind, but there are colorblind disabilities as well. So color contrast is really good for people who can't see all the spectrum. It's also really good if you're trying to look at something on your cell phone on a really sunny day. Having a really bright contrast will allow you to read that newsletter better. So we use WebAIM color contrast checker. You just give them a hex value for the background, the hex color for the foreground, and you can check the ratio. This is very wordy, it's a little confusing, but the large font is supposed to have a 3:1 ratio from background to foreground, and small is 4.1. At Q2, we just shoot for the AA rating. I gave you, up here is also the AAA rating. That one's really hard to achieve. They usually require like at least 3 modes of interacting with something, where AA is 2 modes. So that's like keyboard and mouse or another, yeah. And for sizing, large and bold is usually about 18.66 pixels. So if you start dipping down under 18 pixels, your font's now small. And if it's large and normal weight, then we shoot for 24 pixels for large. And most of good accessibility is a good HTML structure and keyboard navigation. So as we're developing, if we can shoot for these things, it's a lot easier as we're developing to think about having good structure than if we have to go back and look at old code and go, oh, nested tables. Why did I do nested tables? It's a lot easier to build with accessibility in mind than it is to have to go back and make something accessible. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is some tools. My team uses PowerMapper a lot. It's a paid service, but it's not that expensive. And it just pretty much goes to the URL you specify, and it checks a whole bunch of your structure, your colors, make sure your images have proper tags. The Axe Chrome extension does very similar. There's also one from the Ally project made by the Khan Academy called Totally. And then, of course, WebAIM does very similar things to PowerMapper, but they go more into making sure that your HTML is valid, and then buy our service. So the caveat's free. And not all tools are equal, so we try to do a mix of all of the tools. In the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of false positives, and it's up to you to decide whether or not like this is accessible or not. There's unfortunately no legislation saying that this is accessible, this is not accessible. You kind of have to just shoot for what makes sense. And then I have some resources if anyone's interested. And any questions? Yes.
How often do you guys lean on a mentor when you're writing code to help you stay by these best practices?
So on my team, since I'm on the web dev team, we work unfortunately with Drupal. So it's not very easy for us to lint our code. But I know the other teams upstairs are starting to use it. I don't know if they're using it for accessibility. We're the leaders of the pack in accessibility on our company.
And like Ember Ally is like a plugin, for example, that allows part of the code process to actually check against some of these things. I don't know how in depth it is, but there are some things out there.
Is there one go-to resource for accessibility for the web, like given standards? Is there one like source of truth? Or those kinds of...
Oh yeah, I guess I should have actually put them on this questionnaire, but the AA, AAA thing I mentioned earlier, that's actually the WCAG's rating, and that stands for the Web Consortium Accessibility Guidelines. Thanks, I'm blanking up here. But those are the guidelines that we use, and there's 3 different ratings. There's A, AA, AAA, and they have a whole bunch of documents and they're constantly reanalyzing things. They're supposed to be adding auto-playing videos is actually not accessible, which is we're all so excited for. But yeah, the WCAG 2.0 is
I'm also excited. No,
Yeah.
autoplay videos.
Yes.
My Chrome just started doing that. So.
Nice.
My second question was, what about with transpiled code? So for people that use TypeScript or JSX, do those transpilers have any sort of standards to transpiling code into disability accessible code, or is that something you still need to be cognizant of when you're developing?
A lot of times it's something you need to be cognizant of going forward. There might be some JSX accessibility add-ons, this one for Ember. A lot of the time it's just kind of making sure that as you're playing with it, it's as accessible as can be. Go ahead.
So there's always a big push when designs are coming out to make sure that everything's mobile first as best you can. And so we're talking about business design mobile first. Do you ever have to come up all the time and be like, accessibility is also, don't just think about touching things. Like keyboard navigation is important, color is important, all these things that you're saying. So when is it like, don't just think about mobile, also think about screen readers, let's think about all these things. It's a lot of people up in the air. So
yeah.
I guess, how do you kind of address that?
Well, our designers on our team actually make sure that all of their designs try to be as accessible as possible. So that means they're looking for specifically color. And then also there's a couple tools out there, if I can find them, that allow you to put text over images for sliders and banners to make sure that the images that you choose will allow them to have accessible text put on top of it. We just try to go from a mobile, as much as we can, a mobile first approach, but even a mobile menu should be tabbable. You should be able to use a screen reader on it, because people can also have just screens that are just this big. They could be using a screen magnifier and make their screen this tiny. So we try to make our mobile websites also as accessible as possible. Yes.
This is in relation to your display done and visibility hidden. Maybe this is naive, but when would you want a screen reader to pick up on something that is not normally visible?
Oh, good question. So I'm sure you've used a website like Facebook, and they have a bunch of icons. Those little icons that, like the little house for home, for example, a little pen for edit, those are where we would use screen adjacent text is what we call it. So a little span or something next to it to say, hey, this is what this means. So that way we can hide the image from screen readers and then just say, this is home. So if you click here, it's going to go home. Yes?
Is there a legal mandate in the US about accessibility?
Trying to avoid getting political. So the DOJ has dropped any movement towards actually coming out with accessibility for websites and apps. So a lot of industry has actually been using the WCAG's guidelines as the golden standard. I know some government organizations still adhere to Section 508, and if I'm not mistaken, that's where you should be able to have your website load in a text-like browser and be able to read it off to you in that environment. There are some conflictions between the WCAG and the Section 508, which is a little unfortunate, but they were supposed to be updating Section 508 to match the WCAG. But I don't know if that's going to happen now. But
this may be a little naive, but like the ADA was obviously well before the internet.
Yeah.
If they don't amend that at all to include like recent technologies or related to the Section 508 that you were talking about?
The ADA is pushing for WCAG to be the legal standard, but the DOJ is not pushing it right now. So maybe under the next administration. Yes.
How do you develop a color scheme other than just straight black and white that's accessible to people? I mean, there's multiple different types of color blindness. How do you? Is there a color scheme that works for everybody other than black and white?
Yeah, it's just about keeping the contrast as clear as possible. Obviously, the best contrast you're going to have is black and white, but this purple actually, with the white, I tested it. Its color contrast is big enough for the text. It just has to have enough contrast for most people, because most people who have a color blindness will see some shades. They're not going to just see black or white. So we use the WCA, or the, let me see if I have it up here. Oh, it's under section 4. Excuse me as I go through all the tabs. The WebAIM color contrast checker. So this one, you just give it 2 colors and it tells you the ratio. So even this blue here with the white has a ratio of 8.59. So that's really good. You can start lightening this blue or darkening this gray, the white into gray, and you'll have a lot of colors there that are still good ratio. We find oranges and reds tend to be the harder ones to actually have good accessibility, but the blues, the dark purples, greens, those remain very, very vivid. Yes?
How do you go about enforcing this? You seem very helpful about it, but accountable teams is not towards you all.
Well, we try to keep ourselves informed about it, because we actually we'll do accessible buddy checks. And then one of my colleagues is essentially the company expert on accessibility. I just kind of try to learn from her as much as possible. But on our team, we try as best as possible to all be on the same page with it, because we're all going to end up touching each other's code at some point. So
I feel like a lot of it might start with design.
Yes.
Where that's kind of informing your design team would be a lot easier and having it start there.
Yeah.
Do you actually run it through screen reader?
Yes, we are. I use VoiceOver a lot since I have a Mac. We're working on getting a JAWS license. I know one of my coworkers has it, but we've used a lot of VoiceOver for it. Yeah. Well, I'll show you one more thing.
That's insane that you said 20% of our users are essentially some sort of disability.
I was surprised by how high that was, but they're considering a whole bunch of disabilities too, right? So they're considering hearing as well. So if you have video, it needs to have closed captions, obviously. And then on the other spectrum, if you have a blind person trying to watch a video, they need descriptive text in order to understand what's happening, not just what's being said, but what's going on in the background. So we just need to have multiple avenues of information. If anyone's ever seen any of the lynda.com videos, they're actually really accessible because they have a whole transcript too as you're reading the video, so you can follow along. They have closed captions, and I'm pretty sure they have descriptive text too. And then I was going to show you this Totally extension. Actually has a screen reader wand built in, and it's in beta, but I just think it's really cool to actually just see what a screen reader will pick up.
It's called Totally?
Yeah, and the L's are ones because it's part of the Ally project, which is the A11Y.
How does that go through a screen reader?
So this doesn't go through the screen. Actually, it would say A11Y. That's a screen reader. Yeah, it would be that on the ears, but
which is confusing.
Yes. That's a very good point. Any other questions? Sure.
So how does the screen reader handle dynamic content? Like, say you press a button and it opens up block text.
So ARIA tags, this is where some of the ARIA tags come from, have little interrupters that you can have onto those dynamic contents. A lot of slides will have it. And there's like 2 modes. There's like polite and then not polite. We always use polite because I guess we don't really want to shout at our screen reader users. But every time that the data changes, it's constantly updating the screen reader saying, hey, this has changed. Hey, this has changed. Come focus on it. Hey, this has changed. So that's part of the reason auto-playing slides as well as auto-playing video is bad, because it's constantly that the user may want to leave that area, but they're constantly their attention is being pulled back to it. But there are ARIA presentations and presentation rules and things that help with that. Yes?
So I was a little unclear because does the screen reader, can it read
transpile code, or does it have to be HTML?
It usually focuses on HTML, on what you can see. So if it saw a block of code, it'll probably just read out each letter and character as it sees it. It actually skips punctuation a lot, which is a little annoying. But, yeah. Yeah.
It's like so it's all just what the DOM reads.
Pretty much is what it sees, because it's seeing. It's essentially it's like a client side thing. It's seeing what the client side is showing.
Any other questions? Awesome.
All right.
Thank you so much, Allison.